Good morning, everyone. Off to a bit of a rough start, but here I am. And today I'll talk about psychology. So when I decided to become a psychologist in grade 9, for the longest time, I felt like I was taking the easy way out. You see, I would open these scholarship programs and find high school students pursuing these real hardcore sciences like chemistry, biology, or physics. And then there was the perception of psychologists, the talkative pseudo-intellectuals in a field that was just common sense. However, over time, I explored my subjects by reading papers and writing my own research papers, and I realized that psychology is the kind of profession where the very people you want to save are the ones standing on your cape. Good morning, my name is Sadhika Kapoor, and I'm a high school junior. Now, this passion for psychology did not come to me in a flash of insight. Instead, it was a gradual process of self-discovery. For as long as I can remember, I have been interested in reading and writing. So in middle school, I was determined to become a creative writer. However, because my maternal grandmother suddenly passed away, my family was enveloped in a period of tragic grief, and that made me introspect the human experience of attachment and loss. While watching my mother recover, I realized that the real reason I was drawn to psychology was because I enjoyed analyzing characters' emotions, actions, and the motivations behind them. Now, earlier this year, I conducted first-hand research into AI chatbots used for therapy uses, and that's how I began my exploration into psychology. All in all, my discoveries led me closer to this one big question. How can we leverage human behavior to create positive social change, one behavioral cue or neural signal at a time? However, as much as psychology made me curious and engaged, it also led to a big, gnawing insecurity. That I was pursuing a subject built on illusion, less science and more witchcraft. Now, when I tell people I want to become a behavioral psychologist, I'm met with 4 reactions, and I will go through these one by one, and perhaps even you, sitting in the audience, might find yourself guilty of one of these. So here we go. The first one, so a therapist, right? One of the biggest frustrations of my everyday life is telling people that psychology is so much more than just therapy, and that stereotype of a patient lying on a couch. Yes, therapy is a profound and meaningful profession. However, there are other specializations such as behavioral economists, research psychologists, consumer psychologists. And although therapy might involve, these abstract concepts and having a conversational style, some professions in psychology utilize a high-level statistical analysis to quantitatively explore human behavior. For example, these are some of the Jamovi files I worked on earlier this year during my research, and they required a pretty incredible level of mathematics to get around. Not so intuitive after all, huh? Reaction number 2, can you read my mind? Can you fix me? A lot of psychologists today are treated like palm readers or astrology experts, and no, the simple answer is never, because psychological science is not a party trick. It's a rigorous process of research and evaluation. Just as you wouldn't tell a doctor to diagnose all your health problems in an instant, don't expect a psychologist to read your mind and all the kinds of persons you've ever been. Now, funnily enough, when my mother found out my dream, she told me that when I became a psychologist, I had to fix my family members first. And while that might be a joke, psychologists aren't even allowed to treat their own family members. You see, psychology is a complicated science, and our own cognitive biases and conflicts of interest can make any diagnosis misguided, which only shows the science behind brain and behavior. Now, moving on, I'll just adjust this. Now, moving on, the third one is something that I'm sure you must have come across, and it's called pop psychology. A lot of people come to me and they tell me, I'm an INTP. What does that mean? So pop psychology basically refers to popularized versions of psychology that are made for general audiences like yourself. And the problem with pop psychology is this example. Let's take the MBTI test, for example. Now, the Myers-Briggs test was made viral in a TikTok trend in 2022, and people like ourselves went over there, took the test, and compared these personality types. I'm an INTJ. What are you, for example? However, here's the real catch. The MBTI test was developed by mother and daughter duo Catherine Briggs and Isabel Myers, who had no psychological training whatsoever. Now, this was inspired by Carl Jung's theory of personality types and these women's own personal observations, but this still lacks scientific validity, which is a rising standard in psychology. So sorry to burst your bubble, but MBTI test is not an example of psychology. Another one, this is a really famous book that I'm sure you must have come across. It's a classic at every library and existential to every self-improvement coach. How to Win Friends and Influence People. Now, this book is a collection of 30 core strategies to being an effective communicator and manipulating human behavior. And while this book would offer you these seemingly universal truths about human nature, I bet you didn't know that the author, Dale Carnegie, was not a psychologist. He was a salesman. So as you can see, pop psychology tries to offer these quick fixes and simplify a complicated science. And the usual aim is to sell you guys some kind of self-help advice or to push for relentless positivity. And while pop psychology has brought to you all some kind of psychological research, a lot of time the meaning can be completely misconstrued. So when these shortcuts like wear this color to impress your next boss don't work in our daily lives, of course we grow skeptical of psychology's validity. And the last one, and a bit too personal, psychology is not a real science. Now, as a young aspiring psychologist, I was met with this phrase painfully one too many times. And a striking example of this is in the media that we consume today. So here are some articles that I came across, and I'll read them out for you. Why psychology isn't science. Why do people say going to university for psychology is useless? Psychology is a joke. The other one I won't read. Unemployment and my psychologists are struggling to find work. And this scene from Brooklyn Nine-Nine that caught me off guard. Psychologists are just people who weren't smart enough to be sidekicks. Now, apart from that one, which is just a joke, all of these articles kind of aggravated my insecurity about my own subject. And so for the longest time, I was down bad. I was very overwhelmed. But then I picked myself up again, and I asked myself some questions. Do we have this contempt for psychology because it is a female-dominated field? Or is it because it's a young science? Or is it because non-psychologists just fail to recognize the merits of this subject? Or is it because people like ourselves are too bound by our own perceptions of what qualifies as a STEM subject? Now, I know this, but some of you secretly in the crowd might be thinking, duh, of course psychology is not a science. It is too far-fetched to be one. However, just for the duration of this TED Talk, I invite you to let go of this perception and unlearn what society taught you. Just give me a couple of minutes to reintroduce you to the real essence of psychology. Now, psychology as a science can be very difficult and challenging, and I'm willing to make a very controversial argument in the room today. Psychology is a lot more complicated than you might assume. Firstly, human behavior is constantly changing. You might see these natural, hardcore sciences like chemistry and biology, but they measure fixed properties that never change, that are constant for most of the time. However, psychologists look at human behavior that evolves all the time across lifespans or generations, with changes in brain chemistry and human behavior being an everyday phenomena. And that definitely makes it a lot more challenging. The second one is actually something that might shock you. Psychologists will never use the word prove. They deny proving any claims. Now, when I was doing my empirical research, my professor told me, you better not use the word prove. It was a complete faux pas. And the reason behind this is that nothing can be absolute, nothing can be 100% correct. So psychologists can only make responsible suggestions. But this shows that there's so much scope for confounding factors. Now, this also shows that psychologists are very responsible human beings who know that their findings can be limited or they can make mistakes, which makes it a very humble science. The next one is that psychological research is just difficult, and maintaining control over variables is also hard. Now, here's an example. Let's say, take a biologist, for example, Thomas Morgan Hunt. In 1910, he found that humans have 46 chromosomes. Simple enough, right? And that would still be true today. But now let's take Albert Bandura, a psychologist, study. So in 1961, he did something called the bashing Bobo doll experiment, where he found that children can learn aggression by watching their parents or their adults. Now, psychologists just can't assume that Bandura's work would still be applicable today. And that is because so much of the human experience has changed. We have social media, we have rising IQ levels. So unlike biology, chemistry, and physics, psychological data becomes obsolete over time, which adds to its challenging nature. And the last one, I think we all should take time to appreciate how challenging it can be to study your own self. In my opinion, psychology is like trying to read a label on your own back. Psychologists have to study what they're doing right now and their own thoughts. Now imagine, you're a psychologist, right? Imagine studying cognitive biases while having one yourself. Imagine studying conditioned responses in salivating dogs when you yourself are conditioned to flinch when you hear a loud sound. Imagine studying social cues like where I'm standing right now while you're exhibiting them yourself. This makes psychology extremely difficult. However, if you're still unconvinced by my arguments so far, here are my final remarks. The fact that in 30 seconds you all will clap for me isn't random. Psychologists have studied that, and it is called social conditioning. The fact that all of you as I'm speaking are looking to your left and right and seeing if everybody else is responding positively and copying that behavior isn't trivial. It's called social proof, and psychologists have studied that. The fact that most of you are sitting next to a person of the same gender, like here, right back there, isn't random, it isn't trivial, it just didn't happen. It's called homophily, and psychologists have studied that. And I'll leave you with this really mind-boggling idea. Our brain is the only thing in the world that is trying to understand itself. Take a moment to let that sink in. That adds to the arduous process of psychology and the idea that psychology is like stepping out of your own mind and observing it from a third person's perspective. Psychology requires an inhumane level of disassociation, but psychologists make that possible. Now, my friends, if you're still refusing to believe what I'm saying, that is called doubt, and psychologists have studied that. What I mean to say is that the very people who question psychology are proving it themselves every single day with every single thought. Remember I said you clap in 30 seconds? Well, thanks to psychology, you're right on time. Thank you.